It's actually great to be back at VAnTUG. I know this probably sounds a little strange, but it's been about 5 years since I've been here. And part of that is because Microsoft sort of sucked me from Microsoft Canada down to Redmond. So I haven't been doing these activities as much. So it's good to be back here, and thanks to VAnTUG and to you all to sort of come out. We did debate about the question mark of there's a couple of events in town, figured I couldn't get a hotel room. So, so yes, a couple of things to sort of know about. I do want to make this interactive, so if anybody has questions as we go along, or just even fancies heckling, doesn't agree with what I have to say, please, especially if you don't agree with what I have to say, please sort of pipe up, because I'm always interested in getting your perspectives. Little bit of sort of background on Sector. Has anybody here heard of Sector, Security Education Conference in Toronto? Wow. Okay, we need to do a better job of advertising out here. So it's the largest independent security conference in Canada. We get about 2,000 attendees a year. This year there's 64 speakers. One of the things that we do is we essentially record all of the sessions, and then we publish them afterwards. So if you're interested in sort of cybersecurity or other security topics, feel free to go to the sector.ca site, and you'll be able to get access to a lot of content. We typically post content from within about a week or so after the event. So this year will be sort of not far off, but we have a library of, so this is our 9th year, so there's 8 years worth of content up there for you guys to go and sort of look at. The conference was originally founded by 3 of us who decided that we couldn't really go down to Black Hat with a whole bunch of different folks that were interested in Black Hat. So we essentially brought Black Hat to Canada. And so if you're sort of interested in finding out more, and as James said, for those of you who are sort of interested or able to go, we actually have a ticket or two to sort of give away if so $1,300 value or whatever it is. So if you're interested, let me know, and I've got a bunch of business cards here. When I was talking to James about sort of what we should sort of talk about here, we felt it made sense to talk about security. But the challenge, of course, with security is it's one of those sort of things of it means a lot of different things to different people. And so you probably sort of saw my tongue-in-cheek abstract. Purpose is not to do things like give you sort of yet another definition of what cybersecurity is. There's a million of those around. The foundation of this talk was I did a research project for Microsoft not so long ago, and it was really talking about perception around the world. And so I'll talk about this a little bit later. And it really sort of brought up some interesting data points or interesting points that I was surprised about when we were interviewing people around the world about their sort of perception around things like cybersecurity and governments and private sector sort of online, etc. So, so there's sort of really 2 parts to this. One is this is new data that has never, a big part of the presentation is new data that's never been published. Technically I shouldn't really have it, but hey Microsoft. More importantly, I'm interested in your views about what this data means to you. So I warn you in advance, there are a whole bunch of slides of charts. Don't really expect you to know those and sort of analyze them, and I will share the deck afterwards if you want the more data. Really for me it's about the sort of what do you guys think that this means, because that's sort of the thing that's most interesting for me and sort of how I think about cybersecurity. So as I say, feel free to heckle or sort of interject with your points as we go through this. One of the big things that I do want to sort of highlight beyond sort of just this presentation is if you are thinking about going sector, we've got a bunch of discount codes and stuff like that, but sort of see me afterwards if you're sort of interested in that event. I'm sure you've all come across this quote before, Donald Rumsfeld, complete idiot. But what he actually does have to say does vaguely make sense if you read through the whole thing. What he's essentially saying, we come across this all the time in many contexts, but security is one of them, is that there are a lot of things that we don't know about sort of the issues that we face in cybersecurity. And to be perfectly honest, the reason for that is more of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt rather than the sort of reality and the sort of fact around cybersecurity. And the reason I say that is because there are actually a lot of things that we do know about security. I mean, one of the big things is we typically, in the context of our businesses, know who the bad actors may be. And we see in the news all the time that it's maybe somebody has sort of hacked yet another sort of retail outlet, or that there's yet another government department that's been targeted, that sort of thing. In the context of your businesses and what you do, the likelihood is you do know what the types of sort of threats are to the business. You do know what the enemy is. And in the context of the threats is understanding what it actually means to you. So in many cases, the sort of understanding the threats is starting to put it in context as to essentially what that means to your business. I'll give you a couple of examples. So if you think about a threat to one business, so one of the things I did at Microsoft was I designed and built the incident response processes for Microsoft cloud services globally. And the big part about that was less about the how do we handle incidents and understanding what a threat actually meant to us. And the context there is, so if I have a threat to an asset, for example, Microsoft ID or Live ID, well, that's a pretty small sort of issue when you're talking about having hundreds of millions of, or billions of Microsoft or Live IDs. But adding to that, if you then have context, so I'll give you two examples. We were sitting merrily, sort of having, I think, lunch at the time. No, I think we're in a bar. That's a pretty common thread with our team. Essentially, we got a phone call to say there was a group of people who had their Live IDs at the time compromised. So of course what we did, and sort of why do we need to handle that? And the response team said, you need to get on the phone and actually speak to these people. And as we were talking to them, their English wasn't great, which not surprising. My Arabic is terrible, which is not surprising. But the context was that they were in Syria, and this was the Syrian opposition leaders who had been attacked by, or their accounts had been attacked by the Syrian government. And essentially they were trying to get access, and there were bombs going off in the background. We could hear explosions going, this is a little weird. So the context for them is their threats were very, very different. We're talking about an asset which is a Live ID. Their threat is, for example, bombs and the government taking over their Live IDs. The risk to them is not being able to communicate with the people on the ground. Another example of that was if a company like Microsoft, so if you have Live IDs that are compromised, one of the first questions they do is to say what is attached to that Live ID. Is it something like health data? In which case that threat is very different, or the risk is very different from just a Live ID to a Live ID that's connected to a health vault account that now is a different conversation, because now we've got regulation in place. So the important part of that is the threats are very contextual. Some things you don't really pay attention to, not really worried about in the context of your businesses. But understanding those threats, often businesses really do know what those mean. Now, we typically have things like countermeasures that are the context of, in the context of the threats that we're trying to mitigate. And the countermeasures can be as simple as things like monitoring. They can be security cameras, all those sorts of fun things. I was talking to a CSO of one of the large Canadian mining companies recently, and he said to me, look, there's one thing to remember about the threats and the sort of countermeasures that we put in place to help mitigate those threats. There are a lot of shiny sort of countermeasures that are out there that have lots of blinky lights on them that produce vast amounts of data. The important thing is figuring out which are the ones that make sense to you in the context of your business. I mean, he said, we have a rule which says that we can't actually replace a countermeasure for 2 years. We have to make sure that it does exactly what we need it to do, or in the case of new threats, that it can't be sort of just upgraded or sort of dealt with better. And so in many cases, the countermeasures, again, are something that there's a lot of shiny and sort of blinky light context that is sort of put out there. I wrote an article recently in Dark Reading. Is it Dark Reading? Yes. Sort of talking about that, and we see a lot of countermeasures are very much the focus of the companies that are trying to sell you that stuff, rather than being necessarily the important things that you need to pay attention to. But the thing is, for most of us, security isn't necessarily our day job. This particular CISO from a mining company said, you know what, I have the smallest team in the company in the context of those people who security is their everyday job. I have the largest team in the company because security is a part of everybody's job. And otherwise we couldn't sort of deal with some of the threats and issues that we potentially face. And so security is often one of those things, especially cybersecurity, where it often sort of seems nebulous, etc., and somebody else's problem. But it's one of those things that is often sort of in the context of the known unknowns and unknown, all of those Donald Rumsfeld quotes. It's often something that's very much a secondary concern. So I wanted to share some data points with you that sort of help illustrate why I care about sort of cybersecurity and maybe sort of food for thought for you guys. For example, if anybody's ever interested in this, breachlevelindex.com, really good and really scary site to go to, because you go to the homepage and it currently says 3.1 billion accounts compromised, and you're like, wow. They have been tracking data breaches for a while. And it's always really interesting to go and look at some of the data points that they have. You can go and explore and cut and slice their data in pretty much any way you want. But the interesting thing is looking at some of the data around some of the size and impact of some of the data breaches and cybersecurity issues that we've seen. And data breaches is sort of one aspect of it, and one of the things that a lot of people sort of focus on and pay attention to. So for example, things like, if you remember Adobe, they had, 152 million identities that were compromised. The reality with some of those things is, sure, that compromises 152 million identities, but what was the real impact of those identities being compromised? And in many cases, it wasn't really a problem. It was their Adobe accounts that got compromised. It wasn't really sort of much beyond that. But if you're ever interested, go and look up the CEO of LifeLocker.com. This was awesome. He turned around in the US. Anybody from the US here? Any US citizens? Anybody got a social security number from the? Excellent. Good idea. When I moved to the US, one of the things that shocked me was you get asked for your social security number essentially walking down the street. I mean, people would ask you for your social security number all the time. In Canada here, you get your social insurance number, and there's only 2 times you ever use it. One is for your tax return, the other is getting a job so that you can pay your taxes. Second one we hope not to, but anyway. The important thing with that is it's kept very much secret because it is a big part of our identities, especially the financial aspect of our identities. In the US, it's used basically for validating your identity, which is completely stupid. So the CEO of Lifehacker said, we can help you protect your identities online. So what he did was he got some billboards and he put his social security number up there and he said, that's one piece of information. I can share that with anybody. Lifelock.com will protect you from sharing of information and stop you from having your identity stolen. His identity, I think that counts 13 times at the moment from stealing his identity. So don't do that. That isn't a very good idea. The important context there is, so the impact to him was sharing a piece of information that was then taken from a bunch of different places. Other information that was then added to it, so his address, his sort of his credit history, all that sort of thing, enabled then people to steal his identities. So that has impact. Somebody stealing your Adobe account, whatever, it may have my address in there, but you add that to all of the other different breaches that have occurred. Now you start to think about that's a big challenge when you start to consolidate all that data. The other thing, and if you, this is really not very obvious. My apologies for this. So I'll sort of read this rather than, and I'll share the slides. I cheated and did a screenshot of the breachlevelindex.com website because I was lazy. But there's an interesting one here, which is the US. So the Anthem Blue Cross breach that happened was basically a healthcare provider. So this was this year. Healthcare provider, 78.8 million accounts were compromised. They're my healthcare provider. That's scary. So from that perspective, you're then thinking about, okay, so there's a big sort of potential impact with things like that, sort of, and accounts from companies like that. Actually, the next one was the Turkish government, 50 million. Ashley Madison, I'll talk a bit more about that, 37 million here. Korea Pharmaceutical, 43 million. You get the idea. These are the sort of breaches for this year. Actually, so Canada is quite interesting. Ashley Madison is obviously the biggest breach that has happened this year, and the biggest breach that's happened for a while in Canada. But then you start to think about the impact of that. Well, Toronto, I think it's 2 people committed suicide because their information was compromised, that the Toronto police are given sort of direct linkage. But you also think about the context of the numbers of people who posted the Ashley Madison database and made it nice and searchable and easy to look at. It's an interesting thing. If you, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, kind of quite funny, is to essentially go and have a look at some of the data. One of the interesting points about that is, if you go and search for country, and you search for Saudi Arabia, where the penalty for adultery is death. So a lot of people that were listed as Saudi Arabia or living in Saudi Arabia that were essentially on a cheating website. So now there's a thought about, okay, that's some slightly more interesting impact that you can essentially now start attributing to from the sort of the cybersecurity world of, here's a sort of a breach that has happened online, now translating very much into the sort of into real life. So sort of food for thought. There's also the cost aspect. And a couple of these things, and I chuckled when I saw public sector being the lowest cost per capita at $68. This is per breach, by the way. Because I thought, does it really not cost a lot, or is it just that they don't care, so they don't put much time and effort into it? And you can make up your own minds on that one. But obviously, sort of highly regulated industries like healthcare and sort of education, etc. The cost of the breaches per capita, per breach, on average, can suddenly start to make some real sort of money numbers, real sort of sense from the point of view of, so these figures are in US dollars, but I thought I'd sort of look at this from the point of view of Canada. Actually, if you're interested in this data, this is an IBM study. IBM sponsored it with the Ponymon Institute, and they did a lot of research interviewing companies about breach costs and that sort of stuff. So you can imagine that the companies downplayed the costs of what it actually costs sort of for them.
Question, when you say per capita, does that mean per population of Canada or per the number of compromises within a given breach?
Great question. So this is per breach. This is the average cost per breach per person in Canada. So in other words, if you want the dollar value,
30 million or whatever.
Yeah, you multiply this by 34 million or whatever it is currently, and that gives you the actual sort of dollar value as the average cost per breach. And so they're sort of saying it costs essentially everybody in Canada. The reality is it would cost if we paid for it. Sort of $250 per breach incident in Canada. And the interesting point about this is really sort of, if you're a consultant and you're making money off selling cybersecurity solutions, that's awesome, because $91 of that is exactly what consultants and software companies sell, which is detection escalation. If you're a comms person, that's awesome, because that's $67 in the post response. And that also includes things like insurances. So if you're an insurance salesman, that's an awesome number. Lost business, and if you think about being a shareholder in a company, that's the sort of the impact to the bottom line of the company in terms of just sort of losing business. There've been sort of many sort of suggestions about how things like the Ashley Madison case might sort of might really sort of come home to roost. The parent company of Ashley Madison posted a profit of $110 million last year. The current lawsuit against them is for $500 million. So you can imagine that the class action. So you can imagine that the parent company of Ashley Madison is probably not going to be around for that much longer. And so it can make such a big difference like that. The other thing I wanted to do was to look at sort of the average total organizational cost. So that sort of cost per capita, think about this in terms of this is the actual dollar to the businesses. So for example, what they're saying is $5.32 million as the average cost of dealing with a breach in Canada to the company. So from that perspective, we're not talking about sort of small amounts of money. Now, sort of that's interesting. The other thing that I did want to sort of look at very quickly was things like the different types of industries. So you expect that, for example, financial services, highly regulated industry in Canada is going to have a much harder time dealing with these types of breaches. It's going to cost a lot more, not just in terms of sort of repaying, for example, money that may have been stolen out of people's accounts, for example, but also the cost in terms of sort of dealing with the regulatory issues and that sort of fun stuff afterwards. I did scratch my head again at the public sector, saying I can't understand why that's so low, because you would imagine that the government would have a bunch of hoops they'd have to go through, but seemingly not. Who knows? Okay. The other interesting point is about the root causes here. As a security consultant, the vast majority of cases that I got brought in to look at were about things like human error. Yeah, it's recording, but that's okay. I'll share a few sort of stories I really shouldn't share. First one was a company in Dubai, and the company was a bank, and they were losing a lot of money through their ATMs in their shopping malls, and they couldn't figure out why they were losing money, considering these are supposed to be secured devices. Company came in, did a lot of analysis about the front end, the devices, the ATMs themselves, about the back end systems, and they could not figure out how this money was being stolen. So they asked me to sort of go and have a look at it. I walked into one of the shopping malls, and there was an ATM there. I had a look around the ATM, and it's like, oh, is that an Ethernet cable coming out of the back of the ATM and plugging into an Ethernet port in the wall? Could I not just put a hub in the middle of that and start watching the traffic? So it was as simple, and that's exactly what it was. People were just sniffing the traffic as it went past between the ATMs and the back-end systems. It was encrypted, but they hadn't used a phenomenally exciting encryption algorithm, but they played a man-in-the-middle attack and were able to replay the transactions and, of course, get the ATMs to spit money out. Really fun, but very, very simple human error. In that particular case, and so an awful lot of those we do sort of see as human errors. The malicious or criminal attack, which is of course the sort of the highest among that, and that is becoming one of the areas that we tend to sort of fixate on most. Is things like the sort of the nebulous sort of attacker in some other country around the world that we can never can never stop, we can't really sort of get access to. And I'm going to share some data points about why that is relevant in a few minutes. So, of course, the big thing with that is, well, that's sort of interesting data points. Anybody can go and find those out. And I would suggest it's worthwhile going and having a look at some of the studies, like the Ponymon study, and going to the breach level index site, etc. Because on the one hand, they're really interesting. On the other hand, they're quite scary. But what I did was I spent a lot of time at Microsoft when I was there looking at, for example, why do people trust, or what is their trust perception of things like the internet, the service providers, the services that they're connecting with. And so there's a bunch of these slides that are data that has never been shared before. And as I say, I'd love your input on whether you think my assumptions, my findings are valid or not, and whether my interpretations are correct. So feel free to interject. But to give you some idea, we chose 9 countries around the world that included things like the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China as developing economies. We chose a number of developed countries. So in Canada, we tend to compare ourselves with the UK and Australia, so that was very deliberate to sort of pick those. And we also wanted to have a cross-section of different views. So both consumers as well as sort of IT professionals, IT managers and what have you, just to sort of get an idea about whether the different sort of contexts, the different audiences made sense. So, I mean, the good thing was that I wanted to keep, for example, in this particular case, the IT pros and the business decision makers and developers as the primary context of people who have knowledge about this. So there's a whole bunch of slides, by the way, and as I say, I'll sort of share these, so I'm not expecting you to sort of analyze them. But to give you some context, one of the things that we found sort of really interesting was, especially in BRIC countries like sort of Brazil, Russia, India, China, there was a quite marked difference in terms of things like internet adoption. Now that seems perfectly obvious. You're suddenly got a huge population that are getting access to the internet for the first time or whatever it happens to be. But what we did find was that an awful lot of people in those countries were leapfrogging, say, Western nations in terms of technology. What I mean by that is, so I'm originally from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe got DSL 4 years ago. Good going. But most people actually don't use DSL, and I mean they sort of skipped from modems, which really didn't work very well, sort of through DSL, and the vast majority of people have switched, and they're all using cellular and especially things like smartphones. Really haven't gone through that whole middle stage. I mean, there is no cable TV. When I was living there, we had 2 TV channels. It was awesome. But the important part is that they're sort of skipping a lot of technology that we as sort of Western nations tend to be mired in terms of backwards compatibility and old technology that's sitting around. So the sort of trend on the left-hand side of countries like China suddenly gaining vast amounts of internet access is especially significant because we're not talking about them taking modems and essentially using old legacy technologies. What's happening is they're getting hold of the latest devices with high-speed data connections, and all of a sudden these are making a massive difference to their sort of lives and to the sort of the world around them. The other interesting thing, when the right-hand graph, I mean, I just sort of broke this down. There's a lot more bits there, but the important one for me was the smartphone for personal use and smartphone for work use. And I know it's really hard to see, but the red one is the one, the red line is the one to concentrate on with the, I think that's yellow, I'm colorblind, so I'm assuming it's red and yellow. The sort of smartphone for personal use and smartphone for work use. And what we found is that really 2 things. One is the smartphone for personal use, you can imagine, is significantly higher than for business use. But essentially, most of those devices are actually being used for both purposes. And so what we're finding is that there's the adoption of sort of consumer-based services, for example, internet storage, the adoption of things like sort of social media and other types of information systems that are driving a lot of the sort of the behavior, but also opening up some really interesting sort of channels for abuse. I'll sort of leave it at that. One of the other questions that we asked the folks to sort of set the context was the importance of the internet to businesses. This was a really important consideration for us from 2 perspectives. One is if you think about what is essentially sort of driving the business change. I mean, you look at companies in China that are now absolutely enormous sort of retailers. So, for example, eBay and PayPal and other companies that we think of as being sort of pretty huge in terms of internet are absolute minnows compared to a lot of companies providing services in a lot of the developing nations, even like sort of India. Banking services via mobile are, in terms of numbers of users, much higher than we have in sort of North America, for example, because they don't have the local branches. They don't necessarily want to transact in maybe in terms of cash or credit cards as we're used to here. The sort of the emphasis in that jumping in terms of technology has switched to things like cell phones as being a medium to sort of handle transactions, and billions and billions and billions of rupees or dollars are being transacted every day in places like India, because they sort of leapfrogged a lot of the technology that we're still stuck in the legacy. And so what we found was, in the one context, the importance of the internet to business, as you would expect, is of course extremely high. But we also found that there's a geographical component of this. So countries like Australia, down at the bottom of the list there, exceptionally important because you've got a massive landmass. So how do you get in contact with your customers that are thousands of miles away? Well, you do that through the internet, because if you want to transact nationally, in Canada, we still have the same sort of challenge. So the importance of business, the internet for business here is great. But you look at countries like the UK, where you can pretty much drive anywhere in a few hours, except around London. So the importance of the challenge in outreaching to your customers is considerably smaller. You don't have the geographical constraints that sort of come into play. So this was sort of interesting. And as I say, in the context of cybersecurity, and this will sort of make sense in a moment, but this becomes sort of really important when you think about, if you want to attract business to your country, so if Canada wants to attract more international companies to come here, what essentially is incredibly important is you have Canada as a good place to, and a safe place to do business. Food for thought. So we sort of asked what people were really concerned about when it came to things like cybersecurity. I figured that I would ask you guys. So there were a number of things that we gave people the options of. So it was data breaches, which is the first column. Intellectual property stolen, and we kept that separate because it's think of that as the economic espionage piece. Sort of, I'm stealing plans for the latest widget, and I'm building millions of those. I haven't had to pay for the initial development costs, that sort of thing. The next one was system outage. Organizational announcements compromised. So we've seen lots of instances where sort of emails, I mean, when I was at Microsoft, this happened all the time. Steve Ballmer, or now Satya Nadella, would send out an email, and within seconds it was posted all over the internet. And at events, quite often, they would sort of stop the sort of the show, as it were, and say, okay, the next bit we're going to show you is completely closed doors. You cannot take a picture of this, you cannot tweet it, whatever. If you do, you're out of here, you're fired. So of course they'd then show it, and it would appear thousands of times on the internet. But, I mean, it sort of happens. Things like negative press cycles, employee human resource issues, external legal issues. So I'm interested with you guys. If I was to say, what's the thing that out of those, data breach, IP being stolen, system outage, I'll go through this. How many of you would be very concerned about, for example, at your companies, a data breach? Customer information, that sort of thing. Okay, that makes complete sense.
Can we vote more than once?
Oh, absolutely. I do expect you guys to sort of vote more than once. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thing that I do expect all the way around, is people to be concerned about, hey, that's the reputation of my business is based on me protecting data. And in fact, when you talk about cloud security, which has become one of the biggest topics in recent sort of times, the rule of thumb is that no matter what cloud provider you are using for your services, etc., it's your data, it's your customers, so you are responsible for that. And that's been one of the sort of the big points that a lot of cloud service providers have been trying to sort of figure out is how do we help you protect your data online, etc. And so yeah, absolutely not surprised about the data breach. IP, how many people think they'd be very concerned about IP being stolen from their companies? Okay, a number of you, and I think that's particularly important when you consider the ability of your company to be able to sell something or a service or provide whatever it happens to be that's differentiated from your next competitor, because of course if they take your plans for your latest widget, well that's a real sort of challenge. System outage, how many of you be really concerned about a system outage impacting your business? Okay, well, and so that's maybe what a quarter of the audience. That was really surprising to me. And from the point of view of when we think about cybersecurity, most people talk about it being things like data being stolen, accounts compromised, reputation, all of that sort of fun stuff. The reality is the vast majority of people were most concerned about not being able to get access to their systems. And a lot of people sort of say, well, why is that as important in a cybersecurity context? Imagine that this is denial of service. So this is a little bit of a blast from the past. Does anybody remember the Estonia incident?
You just said something I didn't understand.
Awesome. I get that all the time. It's my accent. So Estonia, a number of years ago, and I want to say this was 8 years ago, don't hold me to that. There's a group called the Russian Business Network decided that they wanted to attack the banks in Estonia. So what they did was that they attacked the Estonian government with denial of service. They're attacking the banks. They're a group of basically, there's nobody Russian here, by the way? Nobody from the Russian mafia? Awesome. So Russian mafia, under the guise of the Russian Business Network, wanted to essentially attack the banks in Estonia because they wanted to make a bit of quick money. And so what they did was they attacked the Estonian government with denial of service. They basically took down the Estonian government's ability to interact with citizens in Estonia, to essentially do any form of incident response. So they basically took down all the police websites, they took down the government websites, and so they cut off, the government would cut off from the companies in Estonia as well as the citizens of Estonia, which meant that the Russian Business Network then turned, over the course of a couple of days, turned their attention to the banks. And of course, major attacks against the banks that nobody could then respond to because most of the internet, most of the networks were essentially down and the government was down in Estonia. So the good news is, if you now live in Estonia, or if you have accounts or whatever in Estonia, it's one of the safest places to be. They have a lot of systems designed to protect against things like the Russian Business Network from attacking them. And the point being with that is, those are the sorts of things that when you sort of think about it, are the things that we don't necessarily associate as much. I'm going to use another example. So Sony, with the Sony gaming network in 2011, I believe it was. The interesting thing about the Sony attack, and actually one of my colleagues got fired for this, so I've got to be a little bit, no, I already quit Microsoft, so I'm good. One of my colleagues got up and said on record, the reason that the Sony attack occurred was because they had forgotten to patch their systems. It was a major outage. It was 27 million Sony PlayStation Network accounts that were compromised. But the important part, and I realized I was jumping a slide, the important part of that is that in the context there, it was a basic mistake that was made by the Sony system administrators. But it was the Sony network, so it annoyed a bunch of gamers, so of course it's really important. But at the end of the day, those are the sorts of things that are much more of the sort of the system outage and the impact about system outage versus necessarily the sort of the cyber attack that goes with it. We actually actually did a couple of breakdowns just to sort of double click on that. The data breach one was interesting. We saw, especially the BRIC countries, so India, China, Russia, Brazil, Russia there, were much more concerned about things like data breaches than elsewhere. And there's actually a couple of interesting points with that. One is if your bank account gets compromised, stolen identity, all the banks in Canada will indemnify you up to a point. Essentially, they will refund the money. It's the cost of doing business. So we're used to that sort of thing happening, that it doesn't affect our pockets. But there's a lot of countries where that's not the case. I mean, if your bank account is compromised in other places around the world, well, you're sort of out of luck. You're really not going to sort of get somebody coming along and returning your money to you. And so we found that developing nations especially were very much more concerned around data breaches. The system outage one of the issues with that is how used people are to networks in a country. So in Canada, dare I say it, we have a reasonably reliable internet service. Maybe a bit of a monopoly in places, but we're used to it sort of being up and running. I mean, my sister lives on Quadra Island, which I think there's about 10 people that live there, I mean, or should be. 150, yeah, that's about right. And in the winter, I think it goes down to. And they have a pretty reliable internet connection. It's part of, we assume it's sort of something that well, and I believe it's now a right to have a good internet connection in a lot of Western countries, which is a really good thing. So we expected people in Western countries that have had good reliable internet services for a while to sort of answer this, that we're not so worried about outages. But certainly in developing nations, especially when they're large nations like India and China and others, that the internet is so much of so important for business that it becomes sort of so much more critical for things like system outages. Okay, now all that being said, because I've just obviously prattled on for about 40 minutes, getting to some of the meat and potatoes of this. So what do I care? I just want to set the context with this, that there'll definitely be dragons ahead in some of this data. And the reason I say that is because there are very much opportunities for things like misinterpretation and cultural differences. For example, in China, the average person in China is much less likely to criticize the government openly. And your survey, you never know, it's all anonymous, so you never know sort of who's going to get access to that data, or you've got to assume everybody's going to have access to it. Whereas people in Germany, for example, are, to a certain extent in Canada, but will do it really politely and get up and sort of say we don't like something, but apologize. But essentially, what I'm getting at is so that there is potential for a lot of cultural nuances that come into a lot of this data, and that's really important to consider because it may have a different spin on sort of some of this data. Oh yeah, and there's a whole bunch more graphs, and I've got a lot more of these that I didn't include on the slides because I geeked out on it a bit and had to cut back. One of the questions that we asked people around the world was the role between the government and private sector in dealing with cybersecurity issues. And keep in mind that this is people's perception versus necessarily being fact-driven, for want of a better term of phrase. And there's a couple of important spikes that you may sort of notice here. And I absolutely don't want to sort of pick on China throughout this, but I mean, you sort of see this huge spike which says, for example, partner with governments to help understand. So this is private sector must partner with governments to help understand and mitigate changes to the threat landscape, but ultimate determination is the governmental one. And we've actually seen some really, really positive things happening in China with respect to that. And what I mean by that, apart from Xi Jinping sort of visiting us in Seattle and causing complete chaos in terms of roads at the moment, one of the reasons we're up here escaping that, is that he is able to turn around and say, you will all do this, and they all do this. And he's been able to enact legislation in China that we in the West have been trying for decades to enact. Has anybody here heard of something called Cybersecurity Norms? Wow.
Oxymoron, right?
Yeah. Well, it is actually. The whole point about cybersecurity norms is the way most countries adopt cybersecurity policies, especially global policies when dealing with other countries around the world, is through what we call norms. So in other words, a country, you know what, I'll pick on the UK. The UK introduced legislation about 15 years ago which said, as an internet service provider, you must keep a copy of the metadata for every single email, for example, that goes through your system. And when somebody comes to you from the law enforcement and gives you a subpoena for that a court order for that data, you must be able to provide it. And it was highly controversial at the time in the UK because all of a sudden you've got Big Brother looking over your shoulder. Like, what the heck's going on here? A number of other countries in Europe, Germany and France and a bunch of other countries then sort of took the lead from the UK and adopted that. It then, after 9/11, came into the US. Some of that's now been repealed as part of the Patriot Act, etc. But cybersecurity norms typically means that when one country does something and others see that it's successful, they use that as the normal state of affairs around the world, and they'll often start essentially adopting that legislation. And so what we found is that a lot of those, it takes an incredibly long time for the first person to get around to doing it, a fairly long time for the second and third and fourth, but by the time you get to sort of it's a norm across a lot of nations around the world, and part of how nations enable talking to each other and sort of aligning laws and aligning mechanisms, etc., to enable things like business. Those are the sorts of things that drive cybersecurity norms. And what we found is that China, in recent years, has been able to step up and go, we're actually going to do this stuff. We don't care if anybody else has done it, but this is the right thing to do. And you think, wow, that's incredible. Whereas, of course, in the West, we've got to debate it for pretty much an eternity before we eventually get around to doing it. And then, of course, it happens like Patriot Act because of something like 9/11, and eventually we figure out that was a really bad thing and it gets repealed. So the process is sort of very, very different. So the context of the partner with governments to help understand and mitigate these issues, but ultimately it's a government problem to deal with, is really is sort of very significant for them.
Now, this is your population, or is this analysis of what they think it should be, or the way it is?
This is the way it is. We asked them very specifically, what do you think of it as it is today?
This is people being questioned. These are all coming out of your population distribution. You sort of pointed out earlier, different countries, different types of professions. And this is in China, when you that population distribution that you asked, people are thinking it is this way, and it is
correct
that way. I mean, you must have some independent analysis saying, well, what is it really happening in China? Like in China, we definitely have a way of seeing it.
Correct.
I take it. I don't know if we can say the same thing about other countries directly. Or is it pretty well transparent? You can understand the security norms every country's adopting.
So you can pretty much understand. There are a few sort of much more secretive nations like North Korea and what have you as the sort of the obvious ones where we really don't know what's going on. But there are events that happen around the world that often what you'll find is the events themselves for the average folks like us maybe are incredibly boring, but what comes out of it is a bunch of white papers. And you often will see nations, so relatively recently, the African League of Nations requested a bunch of delegates to go from Western Europe because they wanted to look at in Africa at adopting very similar policies to those in Europe. And what they did was they then published their findings as a bunch of white papers. So if you really can't sleep at night, look up Africa League of Nations and cybersecurity policies.
This is a group of disparate nations within Africa that are looking they did it as a shared group effort, and then they're all gonna individually, presumably very similarly, adopt these.
Exactly. And so, I mean, we do double check these. And the nice thing was I was working at Microsoft when we did this research. I was able to sit down with the global cybersecurity policy teams and say, hey, does this make sense to you? And they were able to validate, yes, these are, we are seeing the legislation that essentially, so this is people's perception. And the perception and the reality don't always match up, but we're pretty confident that sort of perception and reality is fairly accurate in this particular case. But I mean, I'd love for people to tell me different.
Well, and I take it all your previous slides have been, about asking people what their perceptions are, because they might not necessarily know. I mean, a Chinese person might not know what his government's really doing.
Yes.
Though they probably have a very strong suspicion of general disposition towards it.
And that's exactly why I sort of had the baby dragons ahead, because you're absolutely right. I mean, we found that there are also linguistic challenges in asking a person in India about cybersecurity norms. Actually, generally well-educated populace in India, but it may not necessarily translate to cybersecurity norms. We had a lot of those problems around sort of getting language that people would understand. So absolutely. There were a couple of interesting ones that we found in here. The second one down is should be an equal partner. Makes sense. International norms of behavior in cyberspace are a nation-state issue alone. India, we found, and so this is sort of this bar here, way higher than everybody else. And we started asking questions around, so why do the citizens of India believe that cybersecurity is the responsibility of the government, sort of primarily? I mean, you do also have other people who answered, but they were significantly statistically higher than anybody else. And the feedback that we got was that a lot of, and I'll illustrate this in a roundabout way. A lot of Western countries that we were polling, so for example the US, in the US they try and curb the federal government at every level they can possibly get, which means nothing ever gets done, which is awesome when your government's shutting down again. Was it the third time in 3 years that we're just about to get to? That's really awesome. But what we found in India was that the various levels of government in India, people had trust that the government would ultimately step in and help solve the problems. And so that was very much a perception of sort of the trust around the government of India as being able to sort of step in and deal with the issues. I was surprised that China wasn't higher in that context, but they did sort of vote much more for the first one. So that could be a linguistic one. The other, sort of the green bars, private sector should be the one to sort of found the norms of acceptable behavior. So we asked them, so was the government doing a good job? And the overwhelming feedback across the world was, your government sucks. Oh no, my government sucks in that context. There is no clear understanding or agreement within the government of cybersecurity threats and alignment to what to do about them. And I'll illustrate this with a couple of ways. The conversation I had, so I was in a room, so I used to be the Chief Security Advisor for Microsoft in Canada, so the liaison between the Canadian federal government and Microsoft from a security and privacy perspective. And I was sitting in Ottawa and I had a CSIS guy, and I had an RCMP guy, and I had a CSE guy and others sort of in the room, and I was like, hey, when there's a big incident that occurs, how about, what do we sort of think about being able to share data? Because I mean, as Microsoft, we had a huge amount of data, and there's a bunch of third parties, sort of private sector companies that had a lot of data that the government could essentially take and make decisions around how they guided the citizens of Canada to sort of deal with, and businesses to deal with issues. And the CSE guy said to me, he said, I can talk to the CSIS guy over there. I can't talk to the RCMP guy. I'm not allowed to. And so talking to the private sector, good luck with that. And so the context there is a thought around, wow, if their government departments can't even talk to each other And this was a few years ago, so very definitely post 9/11. How do we expect the government to really function? Now, of course, the pendulum does swing completely the opposite way, and I'll give you two words, Edward Snowden, where essentially the pendulum in the US swung so far one way that essentially somebody who is a low-level analyst, etc., was able to get access to way more information from all sorts of different government departments than an individual should really ever be exposed to, because of the security and sensitivity of that information. I mean, it's been really important as sort of human beings and as citizens of various countries to understand perhaps what governments are keeping data-wise, what they're collecting, what they're doing with that information. But there is a point at which sort of people potentially losing their lives over sort of information that's been exposed. And what Edward Snowden did was he really highlighted how far the pendulum had swung within the US government sort of post 9/11, because they were really worried, of course, about the fallout from 9/11, where a lot of different agencies turned around and said, hey, if we pulled our information, we may have been able to do something about this. So, I mean, that sort of juxtaposition between having the conversation with CSIS and CSE guys, etc., and sort of somebody like Edward Snowden sort of gives us an idea about, do we really think that the government is able to deal with cybersecurity issues? And the feedback we got was, no. We really don't think they can help us deal with cybersecurity issues, which actually makes sense. So Canada, for example, a vast majority of our critical infrastructure is privately owned here. So it is much more of a sort of a private sector issue than it is about a public sector issue. So the public sector, the government may own things like critical infrastructure. So October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and a big part of that is sort of dealing with or making things like online safety training in Canada, but also sort of driving awareness between the public and private sector of how they should be working together. And for example, Public Safety Canada owns that mandate here. And they have been really struggling to bring the public and private sector together to sort of help with that. Partly because in Canada, so much of things like critical infrastructure, banking, et cetera, is all privately owned. And so that means that typically we find in Canada, people understand and realize that. So they realize that in order for the cybersecurity issues to be dealt with here, it has to have a big sort of private sector play as well as public sector. But from the private sector, I mean, not surprisingly, the first thing that came out of this was people saying private sector companies should build reliable and secure products and services. Who knew? But it does actually translate. And is anybody, you probably all got accounts with Google or Amazon or Microsoft or whatever. And you probably noticed over the last couple of years especially, there's now multi-factor authentication. And it seems really annoying that I get a text message every time I try and log into my OneDrive account from an unregistered machine. But the great thing is when somebody else tries to log into my OneDrive account from an unregistered machine, I get a text message. I know about it and they can't get in because I have the code. So if they ever got my cell phone, so have you tried to clone my phone? Good. So the really important piece about that is your perceptions and the perceptions of people are driving change within the private sector, because people are turning around quite rightly and saying all email should go across your various networks encrypted. It should be stored in an encrypted manner so that somebody else can't do man in the middle or sort of interception. And so those are the really important changes that sort of public perception is really driving in the private sector. I don't think it's coming to the public sector yet, but it is sort of really driving the private sector to sort of think about how they do and sort of deal with things like issues and the services and products they provide. So that's sort of not surprising at all. We also asked things like, how should the internet be used? This is where there are a lot of dragons, so bear with me. We asked, should my government leverage the internet to gain or maintain economic advantage over foreign nations? So think of this as corporate espionage sponsored by governments. And we've seen lots and lots and lots of these types of attacks that have happened where we see signatures of hackers essentially on the types of malware in state-sponsored attacks that we know that they've been paid for by governments. There was a recent attack against South Korea, and we know that the attackers were in China. But we know that it was actually the North Korean government that paid the hackers in China to attack South Korea. No great surprise, but the underlying issue was about sort of nation state attacking nation state, but it was also an economic thing. And so what we found was that there were a number of countries that were significantly higher in terms of people's perception around whether it was reasonable or not for their governments to use the internet for essentially economic advantage. And the distribution, and I want to be a little careful and sensitive about this, the distribution was more of the developing nations seeing that they could use, or thinking it was a positive thing to use the internet for economic advantage versus nations like Germany, where, for example, Germany specifically, and I'll just pull those out, they were higher than I thought they would be in terms of agreeing, but the Germans tend to be really, really sensitive about sort of security and privacy and separating business and sort of personal life, etc. Then you start to ask questions about, what about military advantage? And you start to see a lot of the same people coming up in terms of my government should leverage the internet to gain or maintain military advantage online. And so what we found was that there were a lot of countries where the perception was that it was then okay to militarily, over the internet, attack another nation state. So going back to Estonia, that was the Russian business network attacking Estonia. It wasn't technically the Russian government, though that's been argued a lot, but that was an economic thing. But what we've started to see is much, much more of the nation state attacking nation state. And so now you start to ask the question around, there are countries, so this is where it's dangerous to pull multiple pieces of data together and start making connections that are not there, but I'm going to try it. And I want you guys to shoot me down if, figuratively, if there's, so actually I'm going to make a joke. When so my wife and I have lived in the US and for a while now, we've got green cards. Came back to Canada and one of the border guards, and we always love coming back because the border guards are always really friendly. And when we come back into Canada.
What border do you cross?
Sorry?
What border do you cross?
Oh, we cross on a whole bunch, but actually, I mean, even this time. Oh, no, we normally go into Vancouver Island, and so they're all really friendly and laid back there, because both people that have gone through that day have been pleasant to them, so they're good. And the lady sort of said to us, so you got your green cards, have you got onto, have you joined the American way of life and bought a whole bunch of guns yet? It's like, yeah, no. Just because I can have an a concealed carry license doesn't mean I should. Anyway, I digress. But it's a lot of the sort of, when you start putting those pieces of information together and you start to sort of say, okay, if there are nations that perceive where you've got massive growth in usage of the internet, and especially a leapfrog in terms of technology, then you add on top of that that these same nations see it as vitally important that to their business and to their way of life to use the internet for business purposes. Then you layer on top of that, it is perfectly reasonable for my government to use the internet for economic advantage, and then maybe adding on to that is perfectly reasonable for my government to use the internet for military advantage. As I say, it is really, really dangerous to make those connections, because there, in all likelihood, isn't. But it starts to give you an idea about people's perception of the value of something like the technology that we use today. And an example of that would be if somebody took away all of our cell phones, we would probably sort of think that we'd had an arm chopped off because we couldn't check our email for 5 minutes. But the reality is that we could still continue on with life, or at least I would hope so. except kids these days. So we went camping not so long ago, no power. Turns out the kids are all there on their various devices. They're complaining about no internet access and no way to charge their devices. It's awesome. We did actually tell them that there was life before the internet. And I do think that we could sort of go back to that. But what we're seeing is there's a lot of countries where the internet is, and the devices are becoming that much more important to not just everyday life, but their view of how they're going to grow their businesses, how they're going to sort of grow their countries economically. And so that's an important consideration when we think about how we perceive the internet to how other people around the world might perceive it, and therefore the threats or the tolerance for cybersecurity issues that we might come across. We did also ask the question of, so who should protect you when you're online? And by far, everybody said the government should protect. And then it was like, hang on a minute, but you all said you don't trust the government. Okay, whatever. That's part of the challenge of doing these surveys, is that you don't trust the government, but the green line there is you say that the government should protect you online. Okay, whatever. So you get the idea. So I wanted to sort of pull out some sort of key themes from this. A few things to sort of think about. When you think about cybersecurity perception and why you should care, from a business perspective, it's all about you. What matters to your business? Do I really care about cybersecurity if I'm retailing widgets and I've got a small store? Well, actually, in that case, fraud, for example, credit card fraud and others, may be a really big impact to your business. So that's the thing that you're sort of paying attention to. If you're a massive multinational corporation, it may be things like the sort of loss of business. If there was a massive breach, I mean, I'll pull out Ashley Madison again. Potentially it's going to take their business down. And so their sort of threats and the things they pay attention to are going to be different. And so it is very contextual, and why you should care is because there's probably things that you that in your business context that actually make an impact to you and your ability to do business and that sort of fun stuff. In the personal context, the thing that I do want to sort of highlight is the convergence of business and sort of personal worlds. And that's why cybersecurity becomes so much more important, because if you imagine that your OneDrive account, I'll pick on Microsoft because it seems like a good idea, your OneDrive account that's associated with your sort of Microsoft ID, that's associated with your Xbox, that's associated with your Windows 10 device, because it insists you have one. Those are the sorts of things in the personal context. Yeah, not a great deal of risk, but how many of us have done things like just uploaded a Word document to your OneDrive, or hey, it's much easier for me to now exchange files with a colleague, I'm just going to load it up to the cloud and share it. Whatever. You get the context of the convergence of the business and the consumer world do make a huge, huge difference when in cybersecurity issues, where people targeting, for example, a consumer account can directly impact sort of businesses over here. And so from that context is that's sort of a theme that I see a lot. The other one, and the reason I got the sort of funny pictures up on the slide, is all about collaboration. And the reason I say that is what we found is that the best way to deal with a lot of the cybersecurity issues is actually through things like training, awareness, and education. It's collaboration. It's essentially being able to turn around and sort of look at people around you and say, from an online safety perspective, let me train people how to teach. I was going to use my parents as an example, but that's a really bad example, because I remember a conversation with my father about sort of being safe online and him completely ignoring everything I ever told him. But sort of teaching people around you how to sort of think about cybersecurity and helping them understand what's important. And that collaboration piece, to me, is actually the most important about how we deal with a lot of cybersecurity issues. And I'll go back to the government sharing with the Canadian government, different departments. The irony with that one is the only way that we could find that they could share information was when there was a big incident. What I did was I brought them and a bunch of private sector folks into a room. All the private sector folks said, yeah, we'll share all the information we can because this is something we need to deal with. The public sector folks then took a bunch of notes, They then went away and they did the stuff. So technically, they weren't really sharing anything with us. Whatever. But what we found was that private sector enabled collaboration typically would trump a lot of the barriers that were being artificially put in front of us. And so to me, as sort of a theme, as I say, that the why do I care is because it's a big issue, but the reality is that how do we sort of deal with a lot of the issues? In my humble opinion, is stuff like collaboration.